Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast. We are produced by the Technology Addiction Team at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. I'm Dr. Sally Gainsbury. I'm a professor in psychology. I'm the lead of the Technology Addiction Team. This season, we are talking about informed financial decision making in persuasive digital environments. We're asking a central question across every episode. What does it actually take for people to form intentions about money and follow through on them when the digital environments in which they're navigating are specifically designed to influence their behaviour? This is a series that has been running for our 6th season now, and there's now a podcast version. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen. If you love and are still dear to the webinar version, this is still available, as well as our last 5 seasons and the Brain and Mind Centre's YouTube channel. So go back and check out our past content. I'm delighted to keep sharing this content. If you love hearing this, please subscribe, share the content, and if you could, please do me a huge favour and give it a 5-star rating. That really helps so that we can reach as many people as possible, and we know you're listening and I can keep creating new content. This season is supported and brought to you by Betwell. Bet with more insight, intention and clarity. Betwell is a free, independent analytics tool founded based on the research my team has created at the University of Sydney, and it helps Australians who bet online regularly see their activity more clearly. You can find out more at betwell.org.au. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Rebecca Glenn, who is the founder and CEO of the Centre for Women's Economic Safety. She is also a 2019 Churchill Fellow and the co-founder of the International Coalition Against Economic Abuse. Today, we're talking about economic abuse, which Rebecca gives a great definition of, so we can decide what is and what isn't in the legal definitions. We're also talking about coercive control and how that is played out in relation to gambling and digital financial environments. We're looking at the space where gambling research is thin, even though gambling and economic violence is hugely interrelated. The harms are very significant and policy responses are still catching up. So let's get into it. Hello. Today I am so excited to speak to Rebecca Glenn. Rebecca is the founder and CEO of the Centre for Women's Economic Safety and co-founder of the International Coalition Against Economic Abuse, a 2019 Churchill Fellow, who you'll repeatedly see I interview Churchill Fellows throughout this series. Rebecca investigated how services in the United States, Canada and the United Kingdom respond to women experiencing domestic family abuse and what Australia should do differently. Rebecca is the former CEO of the Financial Literacy Australia, where she led Money Smart Week and has worked at the Commonwealth Bank on employee financial wellbeing. She began her career in journalism at the ABC and Australian Associated Press. What makes Rebecca a perfect guest in this series is that she has worked at both sides of the problem: financial literacy at scale and economic abuse at the level of individuals. Rebecca brings to this conversation a set of questions around the intersection of gambling and domestic and family violence that the research has only just begun to answer. So I'm really pleased. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for coming on today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's for me, it's such an exciting conversation because I know gambling is a massive factor in some of the work that we do, and I don't think it's had enough attention. So I come to this with many questions, but maybe not that many answers, but I'm really excited to get into the conversation.
Well, and I think that just goes to show as well throughout what we'll be talking about, that from my side of the table, gambling and domestic and family violence co-occur at rates that are just not coincidental. Correct. We know from research that problem gambling is significantly more prevalent in households with domestic and family violence, and the relationships go in both directions. That gambling can drive abusive financial behaviour and physical abuse, and we might get into what that all is defined as, but as well, abuse can drive people towards gambling as an escape and as a safe place, or even as a way to be with the partner who is in gambling as well. And that partners and children of people with gambling problems are largely invisible in the research, as well as the intergenerational impacts of gambling. We also know that financial harms in both directions are often hidden from partners, from services, and sometimes from the person experiencing them. So, Rebecca, your work is so important because it sits at the intersection of financial literacy and economic abuse. And so my first question for you is to really help us situate that connection from what you see in your work, in your money clinics, in your research. Can you describe how gambling sits within the picture of domestic and family violence, and what does it look like?
Yeah, and I think you've set it up really, really well in that it can drive behaviour in both directions. And so I guess to sort of provide some context for people listening, in our work we deliver money clinics. Money clinics are direct one-to-one support with financial abuse specialist financial counsellors for women and gender diverse people experiencing domestic financial abuse. So often they present with concerns about their financial safety, with debts they didn't know they had, with a whole range of financial stresses caused by the behaviour of most often an intimate partner, but sometimes family members and so on. So that is one of the pieces of work. Another piece of our work is a lot of our advocacy and sort of policy engagement is informed by our lived experience advisory panel. So that's more than 70 women and non-binary people with experiences of economic abuse who I talk to in quite some depth about their experiences. So there's kind of two main inputs of people's lived experiences from which we draw. So in the money clinic context, we very regularly, and I mean every financial counsellor would be seeing this every week, that clients who present will refer to their partner's gambling problem as an important sort of source of the stress. What that might look like specifically is taking household money, which might be needed for the rent or mortgage, bills, even in some really sort of extreme case, like food, like literally the means of survival are being taken out of that sort of household, resource for gambling. But we also see things like loans being taken out in our client's name, either because they've been, directly coerced into it with threats or with violence, or fraudulently, that they might not even know it's happening, or they certainly didn't consent to it, but the abuser went ahead and did that anyway. Sometimes, of course, it happens without the client's knowledge, and that one's obviously trickier in terms of supporting someone if they don't know it's happening, because it takes time for that to emerge. But we've certainly seen a lot of women who think that they're building up their financial security, perhaps putting more money into the redraw on a mortgage as an example, but of course they then realise that there is no money in that redraw, and that's when the whole sort of house of cards comes down. So but that secret gambling, I think, that's something that really emerged from conversations we had with members of the lived experience panel. Because obviously if it's secret, it's not being presented to us in a money clinic. And so it's very often that post-separation and quite a bit down the track that, survivors will say, at the time I just couldn't figure out where the money was going. Like it just didn't add up. And I was told I was stupid or I didn't understand. So you kind of just left it alone. But then, either as debt collectors or, they've done their detective work and figured out what had actually been happening. And what had actually been happening was there was a secret gambling problem there. So we see all of those different kinds of things through our work.
Yeah, and look, it's just really devastating. I have to say that one of the reasons I got into research was working with individuals and seeing those situations with family members that, you can start to repair and move forward, but you cannot undo. And gambling is quite unique in that sense that it's not just physical consequences in terms of addictive behaviour. Those consequences really are very, very permanent and long-lasting well after any gambling has actually been addressed. Yeah. And the other thing you mentioned is that how invisible this is. And this is to me just such a quandary that for some people, they've got no idea that they're actually experiencing gambling harms because that's been hidden from them. And then obviously those gambling harms are invisible if that person doesn't know. But there's also really a lack of screening. There recently in Australia is a greater awareness of the significant other. But, maybe just briefly you could talk about some of the consequences of that invisibility, maybe at a service level.
Yeah, I mean, the not knowing where to direct people is a big factor, and I think often, certainly in a money clinic context, there are such immediate needs that are presenting. There's only so much capacity, and so you do, for really good reasons, go to the immediate concern that's in front of you. I think probably I'm not saying anything. You obviously know a lot more about gambling than I do, but that, women will often say to us, I've said, we should get you help. And, there's no interest in seeking that help or no acknowledgement that there's even a problem. It's pretty hard to know what next steps to take. And so, obviously in our service context, we just can take the step to try and support the person in front of us. But the harms, as you say, are just so significant and long lasting for the people being impacted out, not just obviously the person gambling, but in our context, the sort of the family members, not just in the immediate quality of life, but very often the kinds of things that snowball and compound. So ruined credit reports. And now, perhaps if the relationship ends, you can't get a loan to rebuild your life. And so now you're, maybe you get stuck in a rental market, but perhaps there were problems in that the violence meant that there was damage to the previous property. So now not just your credit report, but also you've got a black mark on the rentals sort of market. And so these things compound, impacting your ability to work and so on. And so you can end up very many years down the track still being impacted by the ripple effect of that initial harm.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll try and get into some of the issues at at a financial institution level, that the way that banking laws and privacy laws are such that, someone can take money out of an account, even if it's a joint account, and put things into someone else's name. And maybe so we could just take a step back and look, I know this is probably, you could spend an hour on this. So if we could do it in the best way you can, but can you provide a definition, because there have been some more recent updates and we do have an international audience. So what counts as financial abuse versus coercive control, and where the line is between, what requires a criminal response versus a therapeutic one? I appreciate that there's a lot of definitional territory here, but can you try and take me through what these differential things are and why these matters?
Yeah. Such a good point. And, I think definitions are evolving, and there are definitions that sit differently within different laws in different states, territories and nations. But if we look at the sort of the academic literature and perhaps the definition that is the most commonly used for economic abuse. And economic abuse, I would say, encompasses financial abuse. In Australia, the term financial abuse is the most commonly used because it has the greatest resonance with victim survivors. But most often in Australia, when people are talking about financial abuse, they're referring to a whole pattern, a whole set of behaviours which would meet the definition of economic abuse. So let's start with that definition. And this is Adrienne Adams' definition. She's an academic out of the USA whose work was with women who were already accessing domestic and family violence specialist services. And so that is, and that's where that whole sort of definition was tested. But it is behaviours that affect a person's ability to acquire, use or maintain economic resources in a way that threatens a person's economic security and potential for self-sufficiency. So there are three elements to it, and I think often the last element is forgotten. So firstly, it's behaviours, so it's plural, it's not a one-off. Second, it has the effect of hindering someone's capacity to acquire, use or maintain resources. And lastly, that's the bit that I think is often forgotten, is that it threatens a person's economic security and potential for self-sufficiency. So that last piece is the piece that is, I guess, particularly relevant in coercive control sort of definitions. You can see that this behaviour is designed to control and limit a person's autonomy. And it has really consequential real-world impacts that maybe they can't access a bank account. Maybe there are, coerced debts. Maybe they have been sabotaged so they can't work in the way that they would have wanted to. So I think that's all great. I think that's fine. But once you start to explore, I guess, at the boundaries of that definition, I feel like there's some territory that, that's not sufficient yet. Things like where there's perhaps a romance scam. That's an example where you see some of these elements, but it's not quite the same. Elder abuse, again, you see it may not actually be limiting their, potential for self-sufficiency. They may be able to do all the things they wanted to do, but there's no doubt that someone is using the resources without consent, and even in a way that the person who owns those resources may not be happy with, whether they know about it or not. There are other things like post-separation abuse, where you see one of the most common ones, of course, being sort of the non-payment or manipulation of child support. It sometimes meets all three of those criteria, but not always, but it's also not okay. So I think we have this spectrum of behaviours from kind of what I'd call like small a abusive through to serious criminal conduct. But we only have a definition that sort of, meets a couple of those points on the spectrum. So I'm challenged by it.
Look, and I really appreciate you taking the time to walk through those. And I'm thinking of also there's such broad impacts of gambling and intergenerational gambling, particularly in terms of learning financial behaviour. And some of the other guests on this series, we're talking about financial literacy and learning healthy or, ideally good money habits, sustainable money habits that are setting you up for a life of security. We're not talking about how to get rich on this webinar series. That is not what I'm talking about. But, having good money and healthy money habits that you really are very ingrained from an early age, and watching parents and seeing how parents manage or fail to manage their money is huge. And I'm thinking of, children growing up in families where there is excessive gambling, or where gambling is used as a coping mechanism, or where gambling is used, where finances are used as a weapon. It may not be something you've looked at, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or experience in terms of the longer term impacts within families and within generations.
Of gambling? Yeah. I think one of the things that's interesting when we talk about financial literacy is there's kind of like this sort of specific definition of financial literacy, which is quite narrow. And then there's, I think, how we use the term colloquially is like to understand money and understand, how, what good money behaviour looks like and so on. So I think there's, I've obviously been a fan of, building one's financial capability, being able to control your own finances and so on. And I think a really important part of that is, the money behaviours that you learn as a child from observation and, and soaking in a culture, whether that's the things that you see on television or social media or the things that you see in your home. And I think where gambling has become so normalised that is, sadly, I suspect, one of the most common ways people see money being talked about in the home, particularly where this escalation we've seen in the last, decade of just gambling is everywhere. The gambling advertising is everywhere. That engagement with sport is almost like synonymous with having a bet on that sport. it's been quite a sort of shocking shift, I think, for me anyway. But I'm not in the field. So I think, those money behaviours, I think that's got a really, really serious impact on, what we're likely to see moving forward. I think where we talk about financial literacy as a more formal sort of intervention, I think it's got benefits in talking about, the dangers of that, the how to decide in a family how we're going to spend our resources. How does everyone have a say and decide what's fair, but also decide how resources are going to be allocated? If we can normalise those kinds of conversations, then I think there's real potential to, I guess, have an opportunity for spidey senses to go off earlier when there's abusive control starting to take place. Because one of the challenges that we have with economic abuse, and survivors will say this, is it started so slowly that by the time it was kind of a problem, I couldn't, I sort of felt like I had nowhere to go. It started in a way that seemed quite innocent, like, you've got a lot on your plate, let me just take care of this for now. And that's fine. That could also be, a choice and action of a loving partner. But when it gets to the point where now you don't have visibility, and in fact you can't get visibility if you asked for it. If you asked for it, there might be consequences. That means you don't even ask for it. Suddenly we're way down the track. So for me, that link, I think financial literacy is often seen as a sort of, cure-all. And if we only, were more financially literate, we wouldn't experience this. I think that is a trap and untrue. But I do think there's some real benefit in normalising having those conversations and having them from quite early on in a relationship. So you'll begin to sense perhaps earlier, and we certainly know with coercive control, there is an escalating pattern of behaviour where the earlier you sort of recognise and opt out, the more likely you are to actually be able to get out without some of the more severe consequences.
So, Rebecca, you've worked on around national capability for financial literacy in the past in Money Smart Week in Australia, but we have obviously acknowledged the differential role of having strict financial literacy and working in environments and systems where there may be traditional gender roles or a lack of comfort dealing with finances. So one partner may be in charge of finances and the other partner may sort of opt out or be excluded, whether or not that's a consenting decision. So perhaps you could take me through what you would recommend at various levels. You've mentioned, from childhood and obviously at adult, there's different levels of financial literacy or knowledge and abilities that are required. What do you see as, best practice at potentially a national level for enhancing whether it's financial literacy or the broader conversations around even just talking about money?
Yeah, well, look, actually, you talked there about these different levels and at different times, and I think that's actually a really key thing for getting this right, for getting the national conversation about managing money embedded across that sort of life stage, because we know from behavioural science that, when it's proximate and relevant, it's interesting. And so I think that, some of the most successful large-scale programs I've seen and have been involved in really sort of target in. So there was a program that was in schools, which was, there was a thing that was around, knowing about spending and saving with pocket money, highly relevant and, and exciting for the kids at that time. But that's quite different at the age of 15, 16, when perhaps you've got your first job and, what's a tax file number and how does that work and what on earth is superannuation and, what am I saving for? So I think that's, that lends itself, of course, to a different conversation. All of these financial literacy concepts about spending and saving and rainy day and compound interest, which is kind of the heart of it, they apply differently at different stages of life. Again, if you're looking to have children, if you're looking to perhaps get into the property market, whatever it is, there'll be a different lens through which you can have those conversations. So I think that's really important. Where I think we can be most effective is inserting, where people already are, rather than creating a whole new infrastructure, potentially. So in schools, we know that financial literacy is in the curriculum, but it's not mandatory. And in fact, for good reasons, a lot of teachers have other expertise and don't feel confident in perhaps their own finances, so they don't opt in to teach that. So I think that we need to think about that differently. And there are some great practitioners with financial literacy expertise delivering in schools. Let's do that. I think there's opportunities around, we've seen across the nation, respectful relationships curriculums developed, really important stuff. They don't talk about money in that. We're talking about how to have a respectful relationship being delivered to 16-year-olds, and it doesn't talk about money. And that, to me, is a massive gap that really needs to be rectified. And then, of course, I think actually once you get into adulthood, there are good resources available for people who are at a particular stage and will start seeking out that information. But we're in a stage where there are sort of financial influences and a whole range of sort of unregulated things happening as well. So that's where I think governments can play a role, at least in Australia, while there's still trust in government, I say, that, where are the resources? Where is the trusted information that we know has been reviewed and kind of, given a stamp of approval, for want of a better term?
And that's a really good point. And you're right. Until you've said that, I hadn't considered. It's crazy that we could have, conversations about consent in sexual relationships and, how to have relationships and not include money. And it is such a stigma and a taboo topic to talk to people about finances, which is bonkers considered how central finances is to everything. And that we don't teach people that you should talk about this and empower people. It's kind of rude to ask people these questions.
That's right. Well, and Relationships Australia and Lifeline will talk about a lot of the calls that they get. One of the key stresses in relationships is finances. So, I think it's...
of course, right? Of course absolutely. Key stresses in every single person, and that it is. But also the other thing we find in our research is that young people don't feel comfortable talking about money, and they don't feel comfortable asking someone else about money, which is just contributing to this lack of financial awareness and then not feeling confident having those conversations. And I do take back to that point you made about the earlier in a relationship, you have these conversations and you potentially recognize these coercive control indicators, the easier it is to get out unscathed. That's boggling. But I do want to get onto the point you made about the roles of other organisation, whether it's government, banking. And I know your Churchill Fellowship looked at digital finance tools, and I want to look at both sides and to the extent that you're able to, that how digital finance tools, whether they're banking apps or online accounts, and you did touch a little bit on this earlier, but how they can become instruments of monitoring and control.
Yeah, so I think there's been some unintended consequences from some of what is about making our lives easier to sort of monitor, where are we spending our money, and, was that a scam purchase, so we can get a notification that tells us that this money has been spent on this credit card. But of course, in a context of domestic and family violence, that is very easily misused. So, one example being, the credit card. Very often there's an account holder and a secondary card holder. So where the abuser might be the primary account holder, and if their partner has a secondary card, but they're getting notifications of where that card has been used. Now that can be used for tracking and monitoring, and if the relationship is separating or she's trying to escape, and I am using gendered language here just because that's the context that I work in, then that is a real risk to her if she's still using that card. That's one example. We see a lot of, the attempt to get rid of friction in our lives, which, in a healthy relationship, we're all Yes, that's so much easier now. Love that. But it also means that if you have some basic information about your partner, which most, intimate partners do, you can, on a digital platform, open up an account in the partner's name or get a loan or a payday loan, whatever, very, very quickly and easily. And there's very little the other partner can do about it. So you've got this kind of frictionless world that has just, put on speed the kinds of harm that financial abusers can do. And there's all sorts of examples of where that sort of intersection between technology and finance, is causing further harm.
And that's really interesting because what we might get into is some of the policies against that. But from my experience, I'll say that when we try and have gambling policies, harm minimisation policies, the first thing we try and do is reduce, increase friction, place more pauses, considerations. It's never about stopping someone, but it's about notifications or pushes or, things to help someone just stop, pause, have a think, and then make a more deliberate decision. And one of the main reasons that interferes with this is privacy, that we can't have to be really careful around sending any kind of notification that would notify that someone else could pick up. So a non-intended recipient, the non-account holder, might get the piece of paper in the mail with their banking statement or intercede the text message. You have to be really careful. There's a lot of protections around the individual, making sure their gambling is very private and secure. When I'm mindful again of trying to avoid stereotypes, but since you put it out there, the majority of people who are experiencing abuse are women. When it looks at online gambling in particular, we know that's almost entirely male. So it could be argued that some of these privacy practices are enabling the secrecy, particularly from joint accounts. Now, I won't drag you into that because I know that that's not your area of expertise, but I'm just mindful of where my mind goes when you're talking about this. So
yeah, and look, the privacy thing has been an issue in the domestic and family violence space. A, it's breached all the time, but B, there has been debate, particularly for those financial services, just like you're talking about, is, okay, well, where exceptions exist in the Privacy Act around, where there's an immediate risk of harm and so on, it's like, well, that kind of applies often in these situations of, economic abuse and family violence, and I would argue gambling. There is those things. So look, it's delicate territory, and I'm not a lawyer, but as you say, we see these very, very big data patterns, and surely we can do a bit better than we're currently doing when it comes to navigating some of the nuance of that.
And perhaps you can talk me through that, because from my experience, I'll say that I know financial institutions and wagering institutions or gambling institutions do have third parties, which are presumably the family members and the partners, getting in contact, saying, this individual has a gambling problem. I am testifying that there is problems. I'm harmed. There is harm. There's situations of difficulty, whatever that is. And then the gambling operator or the financial institution being unable to act on that because of privacy laws. And then, on the flip side, we know that wagering operators or financial institutions will say, well, we weren't sure there was any patterns in data. We didn't know that there was a gambling problem. But the privacy issues means they aren't able to kind of connect these two, where there's evidence of harm being reported, but they can't kind of confirm or deny. So maybe you can talk me through, Rebecca, give us some good news. What are banks doing in Australia or overseas? Where are the economic abuse policies that are being embedded? Where are the changes that do make a difference?
I think there's a couple of key changes we've seen in banks in Australia, and I will acknowledge this. The banks in Australia are leading the world in terms of their responses to financial and economic abuse. Still work to do, obviously, but they are taking it seriously. And I think there's, perhaps the fact of the Royal Commission has kind of led to a period of time where their social responsibility is more evident and embedded in their practices. And certainly the regulations have required that. So we have things like, I guess in the level that we deal with on a day-to-day basis with the money clinics, the uplift in their hardship teams, their specialist extra care teams. They're all called different things, but where people are having difficulty, the response to that from a customer service perspective in banks has really been improved. So they have a deeper understanding now of the dynamics of family violence, an understanding that financial abuse is very likely the leading reason that someone is going to get in touch with them about a concern they have related to that family violence, and sort of some steps that they can take to support that person at that time, including referring on to people like us or other services. I think the other thing that's been really important, and we were part of a campaign to start this, was looking at terms and conditions. So you briefly touched on earlier joint accounts, where if joint accounts are one to sign, which is the most common way they're set up, it is perfectly legal for one party or the other in a relationship to remove all of the money from that account. That's legal. There is no recourse. Game over. Wow. That's high stakes for very little kind of protection. And so one of the things I think is important that banks have done is start to look at their terms and conditions. So where they say, actually, one of the terms and conditions of you taking out this product with us is that if you use this product to perpetrate financial abuse, we reserve the right to stop doing business with you. So that's quite a catch-all, and we haven't seen how it's been used yet. So I think we're sort of only at the point of, well, a lot of banks have now instituted that and include a term and condition. But it is the contract with the customer. So it does present for the first time an opportunity for banks to say, well, actually, we don't approve of the way that you have used that product, and there's been, this complaint, this evidence about your misuse of that product, and so we're not going to do business with you anymore. So I think there's some discretion being built in by having that term and condition, by the uplift of those customer service teams to better support survivors of financial abuse where it becomes evident that's what's going on.
Look, congratulations, Rebecca. It's I know to maybe an uninitiated ear, changing terms and conditions doesn't sound like a big deal, but that is massive. That is such an accomplishment. And as you say, it really just puts that in perspective, because a lot of the time I have heard financial institutions, and I will say I've engaged with many, and they're interested in gambling and they are well-intentioned. And the big banks and financial institutions do have advocacy and customer support teams. But being able to do that, it does really take away the previous conversations I've held where it's their money, credit we can stop, but if it's a savings account, if it's their money in account, they can do whatever they want to do. But you've really shown that it's not. It's a product that you're facilitating. If they want to do whatever they want with their money, take it and stuff it under a mattress. If they want to use your institution to transact, then the institution does have responsibility for how that is being used. So I love that, and I will definitely be keen to follow up more. Then stepping from institutions, and I am keen, and if anyone has any thoughts, they can, put in the show notes, or Rebecca, if you have any thoughts about how gambling operators could have similar obligations in relation to reports of economic abuse, that would be a pretty interesting one to look at. But for now, your Churchill Fellowship also looked at legislation. It shapes funding, service design, accountability, all of this framework. And I know we're not lawyers, so we won't get into it. There have been, Australia has had some world-leading work. There's been important changes, but what do you see as important policy changes, either that you've seen internationally? What would you like to see happen to enhance policies at a government level to reduce financial abuse?
So I think we've seen something really important underway at the moment, which is the government's calling it a systems audit. What that is, in effect, is, and there are abuses of the system that are just designed to annoy, agitate, and cause harm emotionally. But very often, in fact, the misuse and abuse of systems has financial consequences. So that meets a definition often, not always, but often of sort of a financial or economic abuse piece. And so the audit of government systems, we have seen child support looking at its processes and procedures to try and minimise the misuse and manipulation of that system for financial abuse. I think actually that's going to require some legislative change as well, but it's a step in the right direction. Services Australia, the other parts of Services Australia, I should say, around family tax benefits and job seeker and the way that can be misused and abused is fantastic that they're really beginning to identify that. They've instituted training. So these are all really positive advances, I think, in supporting people who are experiencing financial abuse. Hopefully it's going to flow through, that we'll start seeing things get a little bit easier actually, I would like to see them get a lot easier, obviously. The legislation is an interesting one. In New South Wales, we've seen the introduction of coercive control laws, which for the first time actually makes economic abuse a criminal offence in some instances. Queensland has also brought in legislation like that. South Australia is coming. There was standalone legislation in Tasmania, so it's still quite piecemeal across the country. It would be enormously helpful, given so many financial systems are national, be they government systems or banks and so on, if there were, if there was a definition that was agreed upon nationally and instituted at that level. I think there are some more things we can do in a sort of protective phase of financial abuse, such as, all of the states and territories have domestic violence orders. They're called different things in different states and territories. And the intent of that is to try and improve and increase safety for the protected person. You need money to be safe in our current environment and society. There is no legislative reason why those orders could not have a financial safety provision. For instance, you will not remove money from the joint account or the redraw except for, immediate needs. That could be a standard provision providing enormous protection for survivors, and if it's breached, what is a totally legal thing to do now becomes a criminal breach. So I think there's some scope for sort of some significant further changes, but we are certainly in a very much better place than we were 10 years ago.
Look, I really appreciate you taking the time to step through those, and I agree with you that the family court systems are highly flawed, and it is common that when it comes to child support not being paid or when there's a separation, all of a sudden money starts to disappear. It becomes everything's owned by the business, or there's some kind of liability that a high net worth partner all of a sudden has no money to share that can legally prove it. And I have no idea if this happens or not, but I don't think there's a cap on how much money you can put into a gambling account. And I don't know how often someone would go for a source of wealth fund include wagering accounts. Now, given that you can have a lot of wagering accounts, that is an interesting idea. If someone could potentially, I don't see what would stop someone actually hiding a serious amount of money in wagering accounts that would be undetected by a family court of law. So that could be interesting, having actually maximum amounts that you can put in a wagering account, so it's not used as some kind of hiding spot for finances. Note to self to follow up on that, or anyone listening to take that one on. But there's definitely, and similarly that, if you're not paying child support, there are some legal mechanisms where you can actually garnish wages that, there's nothing to stop someone gambling instead of paying, their child support or whatever those obligations are. Now, I knew this would happen, Rebecca, that we're running out of time. And I did know this would happen. It always happens, but I do want to give you an opportunity to look ahead. Young people are spending money in such a complicated world now. We've got buy now, pay later. You've mentioned the online influencers, online relationships, romance scams. What do you see as risks, or what are the risks for the current generation of teenagers, young adults moving forward?
I think we've probably touched on them already. There's the sort of the frictionless digital world that we're in. B, the sort of the lack of regulation around financial and other advice on social media, and the normalization of things like gambling, and again, I guess this kind of some of the sort of the backlash against women's rights in that sort of social media sphere. I think this is a really sort of toxic mix of accelerating harm. And I'm a lover of behavioral science. I find it fascinating. I'm not a behavioral scientist, I have to say, but I do see all of those harms are being created by people who, without morals or ethics, are happy to use the best behavioral science for evil. And I think we've just got to be a lot smarter about doing that for good. How do we all of those kinds of, what's the dopamine hit for fun right now, for the new purchase right now? How do we make it easy to do the right thing? I don't have the answers, but I certainly feel like a lot of that sort of understanding's been weaponized for harm, and I feel for young people where there's so much information coming at them all the time. A culture of gambling that's been normalized, the digital nature of all of our financial products. There's a lot of places it can go wrong.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a theme, not just of this season, but of most conversations I'm having at the moment. Look, to finish up, we mentioned that there's not enough understanding of the relationship between gambling and domestic and family violence and economic abuse. Probably there's a million answers to this question, but what would you like to see happen in this space?
I really think we need to be spending a lot more attention on this space and making those connections more overtly. In terms of the research, look, something that's really been on my mind and I would love to see more work go into this is I think there's gambling research happening over here with people who have problem gambling, and there's research over here into domestic and family violence, and it's talking to victims of domestic abuse. I would love to see the gambling researchers talk to the partners and family members of the problem gambler, and I would love to see domestic violence researchers talk to the partner, and that's happening more and more. But I don't know that there's a focus on gambling in that. So I think that those two need to be brought together, and I would love to see some more work done on really unpacking those connections.
I agree. And I would echo that also, just asking a question about gambling. When a police responds to a domestic violence incident, they make a note on the file, is alcohol involved? When a court case, when there's a family court case, there's a note, is it drugs, is it alcohol? If there was just a checkbox somewhere that we could count gambling across all the different situations, bankruptcy, family, domestic violence, if there was just a checkbox somewhere so we could start to get some statistics, we would be flooded with what we do already know as practitioners and as community members, but we could actually have some metrics to start to show not only we need this, but then we can start to track whether policies are working. Look, Rebecca, I've taken so much of your time and I so appreciate your expertise. You're not off the hook yet. I'd love to know, you've mentioned a few things. Obviously, there's your Churchill Fellowship report, which if anyone doesn't know how to find the Churchill Fellowships, they are amazing. So check out the Churchill Fellowship site and you can type in Rebecca's name, Rebecca Glenn. What other resources? You mentioned money clinics. Where would you recommend someone who goes to find out more around some of the things you talked about? And we can also add links in the show notes as well.
Sure. So we have a website called the Financial Safety Site. It's for anyone who is concerned about their finances in the context of a relationship, or perhaps concerned about someone they know. So that's financialsafety.org.au. It has not just lots of information, but some tools and resources, and also a national directory of services that could be useful. So I highly recommend that as a starting point if you're starting to think about all things financial and economic abuse.
That's brilliant. And where are you gaining knowledge right now? Are you reading, listening, following anyone that the audience might want to know about?
Yeah, look, one of the most powerful influences for me in thinking about how I do the work that I do is a resource called Insight Exchange. and I can give you the link for the show notes. But it's really a very powerful reflective resource for people working in and around violence and abuse. So yeah, and it's there is one particular piece, if you look at nothing else, that I would highly recommend, and that is on that website, insideexchange.net, and it's called Follow My Lead. Now, there's a little booklet, but there's a 4-minute video, Follow My Lead, and it is, I guess, we talk about it at the Centre for Women's Economic Safety as being sort of the North Star of how we do what we do. So that would be my recommendation.
That is brilliant. A really practical suggestion. Thank you, Rebecca. Look, this conversation did what I knew it would do. It's taken our season's central question about the gap between intention and behaviour, why are people not necessarily acting in their best financial interests, and shown that this is in the hardest case, that in a coercive control context, the gap isn't a failure necessarily of knowledge or motivation, it's imposed on an individual. Yeah. And the response requires not just teaching people better, although we do need this, potentially, particularly around talking openly about money in a destigmatized, open and frank way. And it's probably a pretty good red flag, I'd say, if at an early conversation someone's unwilling to talk about money. That's an early red flag to have. But to give people the confidence to have those conversations and empower people to know that if someone doesn't want to talk about money, that's not you, that's them. Whether it's a friend or obviously in a relationship. But we do need better systems and support for the recognition of these issues in the law, in platform and services design, and in professional practice. So it's not the individual problem, it's an environmental problem. And this is, I say, a really key takeaway from me. So thank you so much, Rebecca.
Oh, thanks for the conversation. It was great.
That's Rebecca Glenn, founder and CEO of the Centre for Women's Economic Safety, and one of the most important voices in Australia on what economic abuse actually looks like and what it demands of services, our regulators, financial institutions, and our platforms. What I took away from the conversation is, importantly, some of the definitions and the broad consideration of what financial abuse actually is, as well as the importance of talking about money and empowering people to have those conversations. And financial literacy isn't just knowing about finances, but feeling confident to actually have these conversations. Also, that Australia is a world leader when it comes to banking efforts to enhance financial safety and to respond to economic abuse, but we still do have a long way to go. So if today's episode raised questions for you, I do encourage you to visit the Centre for Women's Economic Safety at cwes.org.au. Also, to look at the show notes, including where we link to other resources, including being aware of the phone number if something was triggering for you, 1-800-RESPECT within Australia. Also to look up Rebecca's Churchill report on how services respond to financial abuse. It's a practical but also sobering read. You can find the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast on Spotify, Apple, and wherever you listen. The video version is on the Brain and Mind Centre YouTube channel. If this series is useful to you, please share it with colleagues, subscribe so that we know you're listening and we can keep making more content. We can also get some great guests. And of course, so you don't miss out on future episodes. Please also consider leaving us a 5-star rating. It does make a real difference to who we can reach. This podcast is produced by the Technology Addiction team at the Brain and Mind Centre, University of Sydney. I want to do a huge shout out and thanks to my production team, Eunice Wing and Fergus Lyons. I'm Sally Gainsbury. Thank you for listening.